welcome everybody. It's time once again for the next chapter with Charlie Hedges as he explores turning the page on his life and yours. Hey, Charlie.
Hey, Paul. Today is a unique show in that it's all about, check this out, it's all about connecting with the divine feminine. How about that? You're asking, what is the divine feminine? At the end of this show, you will learn a ton about the place and role of the divine feminine in your life today. Our guest, former Catholic school teacher and spiritual guide, Kathleen Joan, has made it her life mission to help people from Christian backgrounds integrate the divine feminine into your spiritual journey. I am keenly interested in what Kathleen has to tell us. So with that, let's bring her on. Kathleen Joan, welcome to the next chapter with Charlie.
Thank you so much, Charlie. It's really great to be here.
Oh, how fun. You know, before we get into this fascinating topic, I need to mention to you and to everybody that you are, believe it or not, the second guest this summer whose name is Kathleen Joan.
That's so unusual.
Talking about it, producer Paul, and he's never had that happen. I've never had that happen. I think we recorded her in June, and it was on transitions in life. I can't wait to get into what we have to say today. But you are not, just to let everybody know, you are not the same Kathleen Joan that came on in June.
Joan was actually my confirmation name. So I grew up Catholic, I was confirmed in the church, and I chose the name for my confirmation name, Joan, after Joan of Arc. Yeah, that's just where that comes from.
Two things come to mind. First of all, how old were you when you chose that name?
I think I was 16.
Oh, so you were old enough to know the difference and to know. So that's wonderful. And I wouldn't be surprised if our previous guest, because of this was identity issues, that she may have used her middle, or not her confirmation name, but her middle name instead of her last name, because there were some confidentiality issues that we had to work around. So there I go, disclosing confidentialities. So anyway, today we're going to talk about the divine feminine. And in our conversation earlier, I told you I already possess a strong affinity to the divine nature, or to the feminine nature of the divine. And I want your help in understanding that even better. So rarely do I start with this broad of a question, but I think since the divine feminine is such an unknown in our culture, you just don't hear it talked about that much. And although I am familiar with it, perhaps you could talk just a couple of minutes about the divine feminine and what we're about to launch into.
I actually think that's a great starting place, because you're absolutely right. Like in our culture, and kind of for centuries, at least in like Western religion, divine feminine has been almost forgotten on the mainstream level. And I would say even pushed to the side by patriarchal religion. And classic example is I used to teach Catholic high school religion. And when I would suggest to students in the classroom, just the first opening of this conversation, we could call God she too. That blew their minds. And I remember one student raised her hand and said, and I quote this verbatim, she said, "Wait a minute, I thought he was a man."
Yeah.
So there's this literal image that we have been given, those of us who've been raised with Judeo-Christian, right-rooted Western patriarchal religion, that there's this image of God as an old white man with a beard sitting up on a cloud.
Yeah, yeah.
And of course, God is like so much bigger than that. Not that elder white men with beards don't represent some aspect of the divine. Of course they do, but so do the rest of us. And so the divine feminine is really about understanding God, if you will, or sacred source as she. One of my favorite ways to put it is if we name the sacred as feminine, or to give her feminine name, then it allows us to start naming the feminine sacred also.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. So what kind of names are you thinking of when you talk names? I'm curious.
Oh, yeah, names of the divine feminine. Gosh, there actually are names within the Judeo-Christian tradition of God as feminine that don't get talked about as much, but they are there, right?
Yes.
The Jewish tradition has the Shekinah, which is this feminine, gendered, indwelling, intimate, close to us presence of the divine. The Christian tradition, really it's been Mother Mary who has played that role, right? She has been the face of the goddess, of the divine feminine for people in Christian traditions for centuries. Then, of course, there are goddesses around the world who are also aspects or embodiments of the divine feminine. Everything from, and in all kinds of cultures, you have Ali and you have Tara and White Buffalo Woman and Tonantzin and Guadalupe. There are so many. If you look around the world, we see so many goddess images. So all of that, I think, falls under divine feminine.
Yeah, and it's just it's so ignored in the Christian tradition because of our proclivity to default to patriarchy and the male. And you're right. It's I don't know why he aged and then stopped aging at old age. If God is a billion years
that we have, yeah.
If he's a billion years old, why did he age in the first place? And then why did he stop aging at 80 or whatever he's supposed to be?
Exactly. And that's just asking these questions about our God images brings up and highlights how it's like a self-reinforcing system, really, of what we value and of where we think power resides. We worship what we value. And then if we see those images of God as a powerful old man king, that's what we're going to come to think of as, it's natural, like that image of humanity represents God. It's natural for those people to be in power. Right? So the system reinforces itself. So that's why I think we have to start really broadening our images of the divine to include not just the feminine, but all genders, all ethnicities, all identities, all expressions of humanity, right? To remember that sacredness lives in all of us.
I love that. That is so true, Kathleen. Many people say, or I've heard it said often, that God is genderless. And I disagree with that. I think God is not genderless. God is genderful. God is full of all genders and is the representation of all genders reside in the Godhead.
Yeah, I love that, right? Because really, if it's within, I have a dear friend and colleague who went to theology school with, and she always reminds me of this. If there's something true and good and holy that lives within us, people, then obviously that is also part of God, or part of sacred source. Where else would it come from?
And you know what the term? Please go ahead.
It just reminded me of what you said, right? Like that sacred source or God or goddess must contain all that is beautiful and good within the world and within humanity.
Absolutely. And I love the term sacred source. I think we need, I have been writing about and pondering and playing with, that we need to reformulate a whole new language around Christianity, because it is, in some ways, it's an antiquated language and it doesn't resonate, obviously, with people today, especially kids today. When I say kids, I'm talking under 40. I'm in 3 weeks or 2 weeks or 1 week. I can't, it's really close. I'll be 75. So I get to call 40-year-olds kids. I think that we need to have a new language. And I like the idea of sacred source. I think that's good. I think even as we talked about the term goddess, when we think goddess, we're thinking apart from the triune deity. And the triune deity, the goddess element, if God is female, as the scripture says in Genesis 1, male and female, he created them. In the image of God, he created them. So femaleness is part of God. Why would we not use the word goddess? It's just not used in the Bible. But I can see people cringing right now as I'm saying that. What do you think?
When I was teaching at the Catholic school, I had a former colleague ask me almost that exact question, like, how does goddess work with the Trinity? And I said something similar to what you said, right? It's just a different way of imagining the creator of the Trinity, right? So we typically call Father in Christian tradition, right? Like that, that uncreated source, the creator of all. What a beautiful way to start thinking about sacred source and creator as she who births all things, she who births the cosmos, right? It seems really natural
as a mother, and that changes our whole relationship with God. When we can view God with a mother image, it changes viewpoint only, but our relationship seems to shift somewhat.
100% agree with that. And Yeah, I'm curious for you how that shows up, because I think it can shift those relationships and help us each relate to her in different ways, maybe. I'm just curious, what has that looked like for you?
Oh, so you're turning into interviewer. I like that. Good. Okay.
Well, yours might be different from mine, right? And I'm happy to share how it has shifted things for me.
It should be different, don't you think? Because it's personal and it's history of experience and DNA and all of that. I've had 2 encounters with the divine feminine. Believe it, and that's why I was so struck when I found out what your subject was, that I had to have you on the show, because we've not talked about this. I think it was probably around 2018. I can't remember. It was 7, 8 years ago, 6, 7, something. It was a small handful of years ago. I was having dreams, and I kept sensing these feminine impulses in me of compassion, collaboration, listening. And a friend of mine is a spiritual guide. She's actually not a Christian guide. She's a shaman, but has close ties to Christianity. But she told me, Charlie, I think you've been visited by the divine feminine. And that wasn't long after Kathleen. A great number of them were women: Teresa, Julian, Hildegard. A number of great mystics were women. That the Holy Spirit, I know I don't want to sound wowie and weird and wooey, but she appeared to me in the feminine.
Wooey, so.
Yeah, she appeared to me in the feminine. So it's not like she walked in my prayer room and came and sat down and we had a conversation, but it was almost like that. It was definitely feminine. And you know what is really interesting? She was not a mature feminine, but older adolescent, just before young adult woman. And I look at that, what's so beautiful about that is there is a certain naivete to the divine feminine for me. It's a beautiful naivete. It's like Paul Ricoeur's The Second Naivete. It's a whole new realization of who God is. And so anytime I talk to the Holy Spirit now, I'm always talking to the feminine and always thinking the feminine. And she is very clear to me.
So beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, because what that reminded me of, actually, when you just said it, was been reading more lately about Mary and apparitions of Mother Mary. And it's interesting how often sometimes she will appear as like a young girl, like an adolescent, in the stories of when people have these visions of Mary.
Oh, really?
And yeah, sometimes she'll appear as a young, like the story about Guadalupe, which was the Marian apparition in Mexico, which was also really an apparition of the indigenous Tonantzin, right, during the Spanish conquest of the Aztecs in Mexico. But Mary, with a lot of the symbolism of Tonantzin, appeared to an indigenous Mexican man, and she was a young girl. She appeared as this young girl. And anyway, it introduced herself as the mother and and this house Guadalupe. It became so an important symbol in so many people's faith. But yeah, that maiden Mary, the young Mary, and it reminds me of in goddess circles, I'll use the word goddess, or in women's spirituality circles, we'll talk about the 3 sort of archetypal phases of women's lives: the maiden, which is a young woman, mother, or the creatress, and the elder, or the crone, right? And so Mary, in different stages, embodies all of those different phases of the divine feminine: the maiden, the mother, and the crone. So,
I like those 3 work really well. And as I pondered that idea of the young girl, of the maiden, I wasn't calling her a maiden at the time, but the adjective naivete came up, and I just thought how beautiful that is. It's unstained by the world. And we know Mary was unstained by the world, but the divine feminine is unstained by ugliness and all of its terror, and then transforms that, resurrects that into a whole new way of thinking. And I think there is something really powerful for me in that metaphor.
No, I love that. Especially what this is just making me think of, just following this thread, is like, we're talking about Mary's kind of the archetypal image of the Christ bearer, right? I mean, she's literally the mother of Jesus. And Catholic school teacher experience, but these were colleagues, right? Like adults within the Catholic setting who had these theological questions, and they would say things like, what is it with the virgin birth? Like, why does Mary have to be a virgin? And certainly there has been helpful patriarchal interpretations of that, right? But I think if we put those kind of on one side, if we can bracket those, meaning of the virgin birth is that we all bring forth Christ from within ourselves. We all bring forth the divine from within ourselves into the world. And so, yeah, that just came up for me too, as you were talking about the divine, the sacred, right? Christ, if you want to use that word, or in whatever other way.
Yeah.
In all of the ways that we do in our lives, right? Bringing divine love into making it concrete, making it incarnate, if you will, or embodied in the world.
You know, when we talked earlier this week, you said something that's right in line with this. You said, it's not a whole sentence, but I got a phrase captured that I like this. And you said being guided by the divine feminine into our next chapter. And you said this is occurring outside the institutional church, and that includes a call to nature, the earth, and to involvement in life-giving communities. But I like that whole thing that you said. But think about the women's movement and the political part of it. When it really began in about 1980, a little bit, that's the early roots of it. That's certainly, I had never thought of it this way until researching for this topic. That is the divine feminine making an introduction into this time period of humanity, making her introduction, at least into the West,
Right.
And we're seeing the power of some incredible leaders that are women, that are just, and a whole different sort of attitude and strategy involved in that. Maybe you could talk about that. How do women, led or in harmony with the divine feminine, how do they lead? What is different about them than male leadership?
So interesting. I would almost rephrase that, talk about masculine and feminine forms of leadership, because I think that sometimes, and I think we see this a lot in like corporate culture and in politics, like women can take on the same, like it almost doesn't matter your gender. Like we can all take on the sort of more aggressive, if you will, or sometimes even toxic or like power over forms of leadership.
Right.
I'm in power over you. So to me, the important thing, and this is where I think the divine feminine, it's important to talk about her that way, because we all have masculine and feminine within us. We can all learn to draw on, some Eastern philosophies would say yin and yang. We can all learn to draw on any of those in leadership.
The feminine energies of yin and yang.
In leadership, and this can be exemplified by a healthy feminine leadership too, I think. But, this is like what's intuitively coming through.
Okay, yeah, that's what I want to hear.
Okay, we're going here. We're going ruach.
Okay.
There's a word in the Bible.
Ruach, spirit.
Hebrew word ruach, which means
wind.
That's spirit.
It's wind and spirit. It's wind. It's breath.
Wind and spirit.
Breath, wind, and then we take spirit from that.
Now I'm wondering if that is the right one. But there's a word for divine compassion in Hebrew that really comes from the root of the word for womb, like a mother's womb love for her child.
I don't know. I know my Hebrew evades me right there.
That might be a different one. I have to check up on my Hebrew. But this idea that I think if we want to tap into feminine leadership, that there's this aspect of care and compassion, and I recognizing that it's like the interdependence of the web of life rather than a top-down hierarchy. If you want to think of a traditional sort of king rulership model, right? The king is at the top and everybody's in a hierarchy under the king down to and like this one's over that one and that one's over the other one, all the way down to the peasants at the bottom. And that's not the divine feminine. That's not her way. The traditional sort of form of a women's spiritual group is in a circle rather than a hierarchy.
Okay.
So that's what I would say about feminine leadership is we want to make sure we're leading in community, that we're leading in ways that really take time to honor the compassion, the care for everyone in the community, especially the vulnerable ones, especially the ones that we're trying to nurture and grow, right? The way a mother would nurture and care for her children as they are more vulnerable and less powerful because they're kids, right? But we want to show that compassion and care. No, if the answer made any sense.
Yes, it does. And you know what word you used a handful of times that I really like, that I think is a key word in defining the attributes of the divine feminine, and that is nurture. Nurture is it's a loving developmental process, not an gymnastic. sort of action-oriented. This is a heart-oriented nurturing that is really common in feminine leadership. And as you say, you're exactly right. There are plenty of people, men and women, that rule in that hierarchy, that lead in that hierarchy. But then you have a handful of those that step out. The larger percentage are women, but there are a handful of men that are stepping out as well. Seth Godin he's a really tremendously popular blogger, and he doesn't talk about faith-based issues at all, but he is very collaborative, very nurturing, and he's a business leader that I think it's important. I have a real mixed career. I've probably done 6 or 7 careers at least. I was in the carpet industry for 10 years as director of a carpet mill, and then became introduced to the faith. And 2 years later, I was in seminary, and then I was a minister for 6 or 7 years, and that was all I could handle of local church members leadership. And you know the story. And I went to work in the corporate world, and I got an invitation by Chevron to be an external trainer, and which turned out to be, it set off my whole new career. What is interesting, I came from a moderate right on the political end, evangelical, but it was in the early days of evangelical. It was before they became fundamentalists. But we had this thing about women in leadership. This was in the 80s and early 90s, very early 90s. Mm-hmm. And are women allowed in leadership? Because you have the scripture that, and I don't care to go into that too much. So I had this question, and then about women in leadership. And then when I was assigned by Chevron to join this external consulting training team, the leader of it was a woman. And I'll be really honest, Kathleen. I didn't know. I was actually questioning, am I going to be able to follow a woman? I'm sorry, I'm going to call myself out that this was the way I felt. But after working under this woman, and I can't even remember her name, but I just said, oh my goodness, she is incredible. This is one of the best leaders I have ever worked with, because she was very strong. She was very competent. She knew what she was doing. But she had this caring side of developing and nurturing people that was not present in the male leaders that I had seen before.
I appreciate you sharing that story, Charlie, because I think it's important. And I appreciate your vulnerability in sharing that, too, because I think it is important as a model almost, like for men who are maybe coming from a culture that says you're supposed to be in leadership and not the women. I think your story is an important model for that kind of change of heart and mind that you learned from the actual experience of working with this woman.
Thank you. Let's do this. Let's take a break. And after that, I want to get more into the details of the divine feminine. And I want to talk about St. Bridget. And
okay, let's do that.
So we'll get deeper into the divine feminine. Let's take a break. Hi there, this is Charlie Hedges, and you are listening to The Next Chapter with Charlie and my special guest, Kathleen Joan, and we are focusing on the divine feminine and prominent of a role the feminine is in the Godhead. And I wrote down a couple of ideas, and I think we've already talked about them, but let me do this. Kathleen, I noted there's a handful of scriptures that definitely point to the feminine nature of God. And we have in the Proverbs, wisdom is Lady Wisdom. And wisdom has taken the feminine role in many Christian disciplines. And then we have in the Psalms, I think it's Psalm 91, talks about God acting as if she were a mother hen, with her spreading her wings around her brood. And then we also have created in the image of God. But how do you see, you approached it a bit, but how do you see the divine feminine in the Godhead?
certainly that role of creator or creatress that we touched on earlier.
Yeah.
Actually, I was talking with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and who was saying, God has no gender. I'm like, that's true, right? Because or is gender full, the way you put it earlier, Charlie. But then my friend went, if God had a gender, wouldn't it be she? Just because of this like creative aspect of giving. If you think of she who births the world, she who births the cosmos, or if you've ever seen images of or some divine feminine goddess illustrations out there that you can find that where it looks like she is Mother Earth and her pregnant belly is the earth, is the world.
Oh, I think I saw that on your website.
Powerful, creative. Yeah. The creatress is one way that I would think for the first person of the Christian Trinity, if you want to think of it that way, right? But I also want to talk about Jesus or Christ in relation to this, because it's another question that Christians or people from Christian backgrounds often come up to is, what about Jesus, right? This is embodied God, right? So doesn't that mean God is male? And the answer that I would give to that, there's a couple of things. One, Jesus had a lot of other attributes other than maleness, his historical sin. Yeah. Jesus was Middle Eastern, Jewish, never lived to be more than early 30s years old. So those are not aspects that we attribute to God.
Yeah, Jesus. Jesus breaks the mold.
We don't say God is Jewish or God is Middle Eastern or God is young. Right? We don't say those things. It's not necessary to attribute the historical aspect of the person of Jesus to the creator of the entire universe, right? Or we don't have to limit the creator to those aspects. Put it that way. The other thing I would say about that, because you mentioned wisdom, Sophia, as she's referred to in Greek in the Bible, there are actually some fascinating connections between the figure of wisdom in the Hebrew Bible and Christ in the New Testament. So I don't know if you're familiar with this at all.
I am not.
Wisdom is like this. Yeah, no, it's really interesting because you pointed out the feminine figure of wisdom, Proverbs, right? So she shows up, it's a feminine term both in Hebrew and Greek, and she shows up as this sort of immanent creative aspect of God. So wisdom speaks about herself. She says, I was with God at creation. I was playing and dancing through the whole world. I was the one who was there when God separated the sky from the earth and he created the whole world. Wisdom was there in the whole thing. And then wisdom says, I went to dwell on earth. I went to make my dwelling among people. Skip ahead to the New Testament. When Christians are trying to understand how is Jesus related to God, he started drawing on those same categories of wisdom, except they called it the Word. So that they chose a masculine term, which was the Word or the Logos in Greek. They said, but this exact same stuff that wisdom says about herself in the Old Testament said about the Word of God becomes incarnate in Jesus. So Word was there at creation. All things came to be through the Word. Nothing came to be as it, right? It's the same thing as wisdom did. And then the Word, just like wisdom, comes dwell among people, becomes incarnate. That was the person of Jesus. Feminist scholars have pointed out that, hey, Jesus is actually the incarnation of wisdom, Sophia.
Holy cow. You have taken me into, I've got to look this up. I've got to study. This is so cool because it makes sense. It makes sense. I was with God because I'm familiar with the Hebrews teachings, of that I was at the creation, that wisdom was at the creation with God and dancing. And it's a beautiful image, a beautiful feminine image of relationship and an emotive nature that's not quite so staid and logical. It breaks the bounds of logic.
Dynamic.
Yeah, dynamic. Great.
There's flow. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I go silent because I'm thinking.
Go ahead.
No, I was just saying I'm thinking. You got me thinking, and so I have to be careful here.
You're like, whoa, I don't know what to do with this. Yeah, it provides us a way to think of Christ, right? If Christ is the sort of divinity incarnate, is bigger than solely the historical person of Jesus, right? Like Christ could be Sophia, Christ could be the sacred that then becomes incarnate in Jesus, but also like in so many other ways, like we all make Christ incarnate or Sophia or God, or however you want to say it, when we bring love and light to the world every day. It just opens up this idea of the second person of the Trinity, if you will.
And then we got, and then in my theology, I've got the Holy Spirit is feminine. So I'm going to have to go search and try to bring some maleness back into it because my whole Trinity is female now.
I love it. I love it. The Trinity has been exclusively talked about in masculine terms for 2,000 years at least. We can deal with some.
Yeah, the pendulum's got to swing,
and that will bring it back into balance, right?
Yeah, it takes some revolutionaries to bring it back in. Tell me now, as I looked up your website, and it's bridgetflame.org. Yeah. I've got that in the show notes so people can click it and get it from the show notes. Tell me about St. Bridget of Ireland.
Thanks for asking about Bridget. Bridget she's the patroness of my work, and the reason for that is I didn't really grow up with her, but I heard the story of Bridget when I was attending a Lutheran goddess church in San Francisco.
A Lutheran goddess church?
A Lutheran goddess church. You can look that one up too. It's the website is herchurch.org. But I was attending this Lutheran goddess church, and they're telling the story of Bridget, and Bridget was an ancient Celtic goddess, primarily a sun goddess. So she's the goddess of the sun and of fire, also of a lot of other things, but she's a fire goddess, definitely. And when Ireland became Christian, there was an actual historical person, a woman named Saint Bridget, who founded like a monastery, a Christian monastery for both men and women. And this was the transition from Ireland was becoming Christian or being Christianized, if you want to put it that way. She took that step. She became Christian, founded the monastery and everything. But within her Catholic monastery, he kept alive a perpetual flame. And that perpetual flame was the same one that had always been lit to the goddess. Oh. So it's like they maintained this ancient Celtic tradition of keeping the eternal flame lit to goddess Bridget, right? And they just brought it right into the convent with them and tended that flame for hundreds of years. And in fact, if you go to Ireland today, there's a Brigidine Sisters. There's still the Order of Brigidine Sisters. And you can see at the Brigidine Spirituality Center, they have a little candle lit there that is the flame of Bridget, right?
Yeah.
So what I just fell in love with about that is it's this idea that the divine feminine, she stays alive and we can keep her flame alive no matter where we are. Like we've been talking about where she can be found virtually within Christianity in this conversation. She was also around for Christianity. She's been around in all the religions of the world, right? All cultures of the world. And it's like that divine feminine flame can stay alive because it lives in us. Not that it doesn't matter because our choice of a spiritual path and a spiritual community is important, but wherever we are, she can be there. Can keep that flame alive of hers.
I'm the practical guy, Kathleen. So I'm looking for tools. What do we do? Is there anything? Or no, let me rephrase the question. Is there anything we can do that I can do? Let's put it that way. Anything I can do to keep that flame alive? What do I do as Charlie?
Yeah, I love this. And so actually, but one thing I would recommend is if people choose to go to my website, which you mentioned, I have a free guide people can download that's called 5 Ways to Connect with the Sacred Feminine Daily. And that has some really simple spiritual practices, simple but powerful, that anyone can do any day. Right? Things like having an altar in your home and putting a divine feminine image there, right? Or saying a prayer but consciously using some feminine language, the divine. These are such simple, apparently maybe seemingly small changes, but it's really about reshaping our imaginations, right? Like opening our mental space and our willingness to imagine the divine in different ways. So any ways that we can do that. So I would recommend that free guide that I have just has some of those. One of the most powerful things that I think we can do to connect in community with other people who are also interested in her and want to talk about God as her and she. Or at least interested in what does that mean? Maybe curious about exploring that, right? Because this is one way in which I am actually, I think, deeply harmed by my Christian history and background. I just find it really hard to be spiritual by myself. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that, and I know many devotees of the goddess have had to do solitary paths for a long time because it's popular or safe or even allowed to talk about worshiping her, for example. But So I want to honor that, like when people have had to take a solitary path. But the more we can find community, I think we give one another permission, and it's like we open up the doors for one another, the inspiration to come through, right? We inspire each other's spiritual journey. So if there's a spiritual circle, an online gathering, a local, I don't know, energy healing, like whatever you want to go and connect with, any way that people are talking about her, I think that's where we really can nurture the divine feminine spiritual journey.
Yeah, I like the idea of community. And I am wondering what we have the roadblock, and we have the patriarchal and heretical issues that we have to deal with that what we are talking about by some would be called heresy. By the full-on right-wing Christian standing would be called heresy. And yet I think it's heretical not to talk about what we're talking about. The duality of God, the inclusiveness of God. And then also, you said a phrase that really struck me, and you talk about reshaping our imagination. And I think that is largely a part of what we're doing, is not afraid to inspire and to use our imagination and not let it be held back by barriers, unnecessary barriers. Yeah. And I really agree with what you're saying. I love the reshaping your imagination. That's just, anytime you talk about imagination, you've tagged me.
What that actually makes me think of is something you mentioned kind of way at the beginning of this conversation, where you're talking about how the divine feminine had shown up for you. And now I want to circle back to how this reframing of the imagination helped me. Because when I was seeking her, I guess I didn't know I was seeking her until she showed up in different ways. And I started encountering and being presented with different goddess images. But when I started really entertaining the idea that I could call God she, all of a sudden it allowed me to imagine myself as someone who identifies as a she, as fully made in the image of God. Fully. In my embodied, not just my soul, not just my mind or my intellect, but my feminine body, and me as an embodied person, I am fully made in her image. That was what had been missing all along for me. Right? Like that full, total permission. And I want this for everyone, no matter what their gender, right? Or no matter their race, or no matter their identity. I want everyone to have that full, total permission to see the image of God in all of who you are. Not just in some of who you are, right? And if we only have such a narrow imagination about God, blocks us from appreciating the sacred in all of ourselves. So
you're sounding like Julian of Norwich. She's one of my favorite mystics from the 1400s and 1500s. No, 13 and 1400s. And seeing God in everything, and seeing the beauty of God in everything. I am thinking that, no, I'm going to go back to something I was questioning. When you hear male language, male pronouns, the male pronoun thing, you were talking about being able to call God she. What about when you read the male pronouns or the male scripture, read men and to this? Is that a roadblock for you in any way?
Oh, yes. For me personally, it is, because not everyone reacts that way, but I think culturally, we are just moving towards a place where more inclusive terms would be like humanity or people, right?
Yeah.
I just think that was an older tradition, because what that points to is a time when the male or the masculine was considered the norm for humanity. Women were a different category, like something different than like the average human. Not fully included. Like when I read that, I would feel not fully included, personally, for me.
Okay, good. That's helpful for me. That's really just, I'm always on a learning curve, and try to use gender-free nouns and pronouns as I can. So inclusive, I try to use inclusive words in my blogs and in my speech, but I never ask anybody, were they offended by the male and by the male language, or felt left out or pushed away or whatever. I don't know if offended is the right word.
Yeah. I had this discussion with my high school students, because the typical language there was you'd walk into a group of any gender and say, "Hi, guys."
There's my one caveat.
Right?
There's my one caveat. Guys is a multi-gender word to me. So
that's certainly how it's used, right? And yet if you say guys and girls, one of those is masculine, one of those is feminine.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah,
and that was just a conversation that we opened up with the high schoolers. What does it mean if I walked into a room with a full gender group of students and said, "Hi, girls"?
That would be odd. That would be odd. You know, me, I could walk into a group of all women and say, "Hey, guys, what's up?"
And a lot of us talk that way. It's a really common turn of a phrase today. So, yeah, I think it's just opening up these conversations to be conscious about, how we're using language and how it's affecting people and what does it mean, right?
Let's do this. It's time to wrap up. I can't believe it's that we've already gone for almost an hour.
Yeah.
Oh, you've given so many messages of encouragement. What would be to our advantage to pursue the divine feminine in our life? What changes if we've not really accessed her in the past? What might be different if we do?
Everything. But within everything, I will give two kind of categories, subcategories under everything. Personally, there's changes personally for ourselves, and I think there are collective changes before we start to do this as a society, right? Personally, I think it gives us more, like we've been talking about, more access to the aspects of ourselves, like our intuition, our emotion, our bodily knowing, all the ways that we have of being and knowing divine sacred truths. They're not our mind and our intellect. Like
right.
we can start to honor all of those parts of ourselves, including, those that have been denigrated by Western logical and intellectual culture, along with the feminine. So I think we reclaim all of who we are on a personal level. On a collective level, I think the divine feminine is crucial to inviting us back into balance in our society, like creating societies where we honor the dignity of all beings. We haven't even talked about climate change, but like getting back into relationship with Mother Earth, reciprocal relationship with her. Like, for whatever reason, and we're out of time to talk about why, but we tend to refer to Earth as she. We tend to refer to Earth as Mother, right? And she is our source of life in this lifetime, just as certainly as God is our source of life, right? So returning to this balanced and healthy relationship with our Mother, who is our source, who is the Earth, I think that we need the divine feminine in order to do that, bring us back into that balance.
That is so true. I have to be careful because I want to comment about, I've got like 4 comments on what you just said, but we'll have to do a round 2 sometime.
That would be great.
I am a major advocate of the divine feminine. I am a guy's guy. I was a jock. I played athletics, coached baseball until I was 60 years old, and
wow.
The F-bomb was the word. I could be I'm not a tobacco chewing, but I could be a spitting sunflower seed male guy, but I was raised by a woman.
Uh-huh.
I have with the exception of one man, my closest friends are women, and I just so adore God's creative gift of the nurturing, collaboration, the soft side. And that's what I pursue now. And so I'm a major advocate of the divine feminine in the world today.
Thank you for hosting me for this conversation, because I think the more people that we can invite into relating to her, I think that's just part of absolutely key to rebalancing our world in the ways that we need to. So I appreciate it.
Rebalancing and reshaping our imagination. I'm going to write a blog on that. The reshaping
awesome.
Imagination. That's incredible.
Yeah.
Kathleen Joan, thank you for coming on the show. I'm privileged to have you on the show.
Thank you so much, Charlie. It's been really fun.
Okay. I also want to thank our listeners for tuning into the next chapter with Charlie. And until next, this is Charlie Hedges signing off. Bye for now.